Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Iceberg of Finance, Part 6. Things are going to be getting real deep and kind of janky now, so let's get on with the show. Most people know Hillary Clinton for being the Democratic presidential candidate in the 2016 election, being a two-term senator from New York, First Lady to Bill Clinton, as well as a former Secretary of State. But what's not as well known is that she apparently also is one of the greatest commodity traders of all time. Yeah, that was kind of a curveball. In the 1970s, Hillary Clinton, when she was a First Lady of Arkansas, engaged in a series of cattle futures trades. She turned about $1,000 into nearly $100K, or about $356,000 in today's money, over a 10-month period. I mean, with that kind of return, it'd make even the George Soroses and the Warren Buffetts of the world blush. And the interesting thing about this too is that she did this primarily short selling cattle, even though during this period the cattle market was in a strong bullish uptrend. So how do you make so much money going against the trend of the market with somebody who doesn't really have any experience in commodity trading? He really hasn't done any since. It's kind of suspicious, and it's controversial due to her personal ties with top people at Tyson Foods, which is one of the biggest meat distributors in the country. So if anybody knew about when people are buying and selling cattle, it would be Tyson Foods. And if you just do like the mathematical odds of her success, it would be 1 out of $31 trillion. There were some investigations, but he ended up not being charged of wrongdoing. It became a big piece in the National Review and a subject of conservative political criticism in the mid-90s, 94 and 95. But it's just kind of really odd that somebody who is a career politician who really only traded this time in her life became the greatest cattle trader of all time. What I have to say to you, Hillary, is congratulations. Maybe you can teach the rest of the world your masterful skills on how to manage the supply and demand of the meat market. The next topic I'm going to discuss is Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which is a book written by John Perkins, originally published in 2004. I remember reading this when it was fairly new when I was in high school, and it really stuck out to me because it explained a lot of why things that you think would not be in the best interest of the U.S. and other major economic powers to do was taking place, such as lending money to insolvent country, otherwise insolvent countries who have a bad history of paying back. Like the examples that Perkins mentioned in his book were Ecuador and Panama and Nicaragua. And basically his claims is that he worked at a major consulting firm that specialized in international economic relations and foreign aid and that kind of stuff, is that national security agencies and the World Bank and the IMF strategically in overly in debt countries and give them financing for projects that may be good for the country, may be good for the incumbent political regime to keep power, or whatever the reason is. The financing to these countries, and they'd give them an amount of money that is not reasonable to pay back. And they would do this on purpose because the terms of forgiving the loans or not trying to cause the country to default would be that the government of the weaker third world country would do certain policy measures that the creditors would want, like maybe it would be access to oil in the case of Ecuador, or not trying to disrupt the Panama Canal, or not nationalizing the fruit industry, which is the classic banana republic example, where a lot of Central American countries, have Dole and all these major fruit companies, Chiquita, grow a lot of bananas there, and they're able to hire people at substandard wages and or not pay taxes or have other favorable political privileges due to outside pressure from the United States government. And basically this book kind of explains what Perkins claims to be the mechanism of how this goes about. And you got a lot of pushback saying, particularly mainstream press, saying that in the State Department, that there's a lack of evidence to corroborate Perkins's claims, and that this is not something that people do, and that basically also a lot of these governments do such a small amount of trade with the United States that it doesn't make sense. Because he also mentions that if a political leader does not comply with the request of the creditor nation, then they will do political assassinations, which they use the example of the presidents of Ecuador and Panama allegedly were killed in plane crashes or that were staged intentionally because of the owners of the foreign debts of these countries did not like their policy decisions. Both of those combined are less than 1% of American imports and exports. So, I mean, I don't think that materiality, especially with the Cold War dominance of the U.S. military, is a viable excuse. But at the same time, like, is it really that big of an interest that the U.S. government would risk a scandal of regime change and intervening in foreign politics just over a relatively small amount of debt to be paid back? I'm not really sure. I mean, when I first read the book, it seemed very compelling to me. But also, I maybe was more conspiratorially minded when I was a teenager. The thing that also, though, that makes this interesting is that China is doing a lot of these similar tactics in its neighboring countries in Asia and Africa. And now you're seeing the Americans accusing China of doing economic hitman type operations, yet the U.S. through the World Bank or the IMF is super innocent and has never done such a thing. I think that that's kind of hard to believe at the same time. So I highly recommend reading this book. It really makes you think. I think China and the U.S. and a lot of other major powers, the EU, maybe Russia as well, use strategic financial arrangements to achieve political interests without having to conquer a nation. Like, I think the Rothschilds are actually famous for saying, "Give me a country's banks and I control its government." Well, I don't think that's the exact quote, but that's the general idea. And I think that these type of things go on across the world, especially if you have creditor countries that have a lot of economic pull and desperate debtor countries who would not get financing otherwise. I think it's just more blatant with the Chinese because at least the U.S. makes it look like that there's a reasonable plan of creditworthiness and that it's in the interest of human rights and other positive things, and whereas in China, people know it's a straight resource deal. And then the other difference too is that a lot of the leverage that the Western creditor nations uses to make political and social reforms such as liberalizing their economies, having a more socially liberal human rights platforms that have to be adopted, whereas China doesn't really care about their domestic affairs. They just want to maximize the amount of resources, particularly oil and minerals, that they can extract, and food that they can extract from the country. Next I'm going to talk about is Swiss banking. Switzerland has a reputation for certain goods that they are known for manufacturing. They have great chocolate, including Nestle inventing white chocolate in 1939. They're known for their watches. They're known for their army knives. They're known for their cheese. But Switzerland is most famous in terms of its economic weight is in its banking system. The Swiss banking system really dates back to the early 18th century when wars via the great powers of Europe and the neutrality of Switzerland economically led to a lot of nobility and rulers putting their money in Swiss banks instead of in their own countries, and afraid of seizure due to revolution or war or borders changing or any other variables that made their home countries far more risky. And then when it comes to Switzerland, it is still one of the most secret banking places. Like the fact that if somebody wants to find out if you have, and this is only for non-Americans, if you want to find out if somebody has money in Switzerland, they will not share those records. They actually codified their Swiss secrecy banks laws in 1934 with the landmark federal law on banking. And then these laws have been able to protect assets of many people. It originally actually protected people who were persecuted by Nazis, but later a lot of the leadership in the Third Reich put their own money in Swiss bank accounts. So a lot of people argue that a lot of money that was assets that were seized by the Germans during World War II that was put in Swiss bank accounts were never claimed, and that the Swiss banks or government just pocketed it and helped contribute to its wealth. I mean, also Switzerland benefited the fact that it didn't fight in World War II, and so therefore it wasn't completely destroyed and wasn't forced to rebuild like all of its neighboring countries who were combatants in the Second World War. The Swiss Bankers Association estimates that there is 6.5 trillion US dollars in assets in their banking system, or 25% of all global cross-border assets. They have three main hubs for banking activities, which are Geneva for French speakers, Lugano for Italian, and Zurich for German speakers, and really everybody else. And the total banking assets compared to Switzerland's GDP is 467% of their GDP. And in books, movies, popular culture, it's too, like, if you're a rich person, you automatically have a hidden bank account in Switzerland. That used to be true back in the day, but during the Obama administration, there was a rule called FATCA that was passed. And basically, FATCA changed it so that the IRS has a right to look at any international bank account, no matter what the local bank secrecy rules are. And Switzerland decided to comply with FATCA towards its American clients. And it probably did result in some tax evasion cases by the IRS. And I know that I used to have family and friends who were Americans who had to face a dilemma. Either they would have to disclose their stuff to the IRS, or renounce their citizenships. And basically, for an American now, it makes no sense to have a bank account in Switzerland. There's no advantage. And I think that this helped with the popularity of cryptocurrency among the American market, because it did offer that transparency, but even that may go away soon. Uh, but yeah, bank secrecy there is treated the same way as attorney-client privilege or medical records are treated in other developed countries, and that's kind of the rationale for it. But if you're American, due to FATCA, you don't really get to have a secret bank account. So a lot of banks now just reject American customers due to not wanting to deal with FATCA compliance. And again, but for other bank accounts, the countries, there's still plenty of leaders. It's actually pretty famous, having a reputation of having dictators from autocratic countries, or people who would earn that money that in a way that would not be legal or ethically just in their home country, would create a Swiss bank account to hide their transparency. Like, I wouldn't be surprised, say for example, if Vladimir Putin had 10 or 100 billion dollars in Swiss bank accounts, because it's hard to track. But in general, a lot of the mystique around Swiss bank accounts was a little bit overrated and is actually completely meaningless in America. In terms of banks, there's two that kind of dominate the markets, which are UBS and Credit Suisse, which are both major publicly traded money center banks. They account for 50% of all deposits in Switzerland and have branches all over the world. They also have several private banks all over the place too, for wealth management and other needs. The tax rates in some of the cantons are particularly low, particularly Zug, which is a canton south of Zurich, which has no canton tax and only pays 12% income tax. So it's a popular place to domicile business, and it's also one of the highest cost of living in the world because of that. Like Switzerland, unlike the US, where the federal taxes are the bulk of your tax burden and states are a much smaller amount, it's the reverse there, where you have the federal tax is 12%, and the state tax ranges, cantonal tax ranges anywhere from 0 in Zug to 29% in Zurich. So where you live within Switzerland has a big impact on that. So yeah, the results of having such a banking system, not just a reputation for secrecy, but also just a reputation of fair dealing and trustworthiness and international credibility, it has resulted in Switzerland having the highest gross domestic product of any country of its population or higher. But Switzerland has about 8 million people, and it's got a GDP per capita of $95,000 a year. Adjusted for cost of living, though, that's much lower. It's probably closer to, say, like what the U.S. would be, say like maybe a little more, $60,000 a year. But for given how small it is and how it's landlocked, that is very impressive. And again, I'm biased. I'm half Swiss. I'm a Swiss citizen, so I'm not gonna really trash my homeland, motherland. I guess to my mother's side of the family is from Switzerland. But yeah, in general, that's my thoughts on the Swiss banking. There is secrecy stuff going on, but it's not as James Bond-esque as they talk about in the media. And on top of that, if you're American, because next we're going to talk about the Great Reset. The Great Reset is really this idea coming from our favorite people at the World Economic Forum, which I talked about on level 5 that we done the Iceberg, and the kind of the spokesman for this is Prince Charles of the UK. It's basically a theme of rebuilding society in a more sustainable way following the COVID-19 pandemic. They want to create conditions for a more stakeholder economy and emphasize ESG measures and a fourth industrial revolution for the public good, and make things more green and smarter and the economy more equal and fair. I mean, those all sound like great platitudes, and it's then linked to a lot of conspiracy theories as well because of its name. The Great Reset does, these guys cannot help themselves. As I mentioned in my critique of the World Economic Forum in part 5 of this series, the Great Reset doesn't really help matters, calling it that. It's like you're implying that there is some dark conspiracy to this, and you're just asking for like that type of criticism with just with the name, and also with some of the other stuff I've mentioned in part 5, such as the ideas of the bug eating and the I have no property, and overemphasizing a far left social agenda that is not very popular in not only the United States but many of the more socially conservative parts of the emerging world. So you're not, again, it's not doing, but at the same time, a lot of these conspiracy theories surrounding it aren't particularly true either. That it ties all the really crazy stuff that I cannot say, or this video will get taken down. This group, and then they throw that all in there and say it's all part of the Great Reset, and it's or the New World Order type stuff too is thrown in here too. Do I think that the people at the World Economic Forum would like to reorganize things in a way that redistributes global wealth and opportunity to them? Yeah. Do you think that there are ways that they'll do in their power to try to do that? Possibly. Do they have enough power alone to do that? That's where I highly doubt it. I think they have the motive, and there is a strategy, but my question is, I just am skeptical of the ability of such a small, lack of a better term, cabal of a few wealthy people to be able to do all this in secret, and basically create their open society-esque utopia, and without any sort of pushback, or be able to just steamroll all the pushback as if we lived in a pure top-down global autocracy. So yeah, I think that they probably have some self-serving idea, and their criticism is probably true on that front, and it's, again, a lot of the World Economic Forum is to wealthy people to make it look like they care, but at the same time I question a lot of the crazy conspiracy theories to describe this as a great communist takeover plan. I'm definitely not a fan of communist takeover plans, and there are probably other ways that if there's going to happen, it'd be not through the Great Reset. So that's my thoughts on this topic. Next, we're going to talk about rogue traders. Basically, a rogue trader is an employee at a major bank. It's usually a big bank. Could also be at a buy-side firm that makes unapproved financial transactions and often covers up the tracks by mismarking their securities. This has happened several times in the last few decades. There are mainly happens is that the trader gets themselves into a hole and they don't want to get fired or not miss out on a bonus because of it, and so they take unnecessary risks to try to make the money back, and then it backfires on them again. So yeah, this is it's kind of less likely to happen now, as a lot of says digital records, and compliance has changed that now every institutional sales trader, or somebody who has the potentially to have a role that involves rogue trading. Now it's take a 2 straight weeks off at minimum per year so that they can't be constantly covering their tracks, and their supervisors or whoever takes over for them will see this happening. I mean, the most famous example of this is the movie Rogue Trader, which is based off of the story of Nick Leeson, who blew up Barings Bank by having a $1.3 billion loss in 1995 trading Nikkei futures. The most recent big example of this is Jerome Kerviel, who lost $7 billion for Societe Generale trading European stock futures. And there's been several other notable ones of over $100 million throughout the last 30 years. It's about 10 of them. I don't really think there's anything that crazy. I mean, people say like these are evidence of rigging markets, but it's usually just people who don't know, who either like just take too much risk for some reason, or there are people who try to basically do one crime to cover up another. It's kind of like the trading version of Nixon's Watergate.